Okay, here we are for the second video lecture of the chapter 20 on ecosystem bioenergetics. You remember at the end of the first video for this chapter, we the last part of that video had been talking about the effects of light availability, nutrient availability, and even to some extent temperature on gross and net primary productivity in terrestrial systems. Well, now we're going to talk about those variables and their effects on gross and net primary productivity in aquatic and marine systems, so freshwater and marine systems. So, in an earlier chapter, back toward the beginning of the semester, we talked about photosynthetically active radiation, or what we call PAR, right? Photosynthetically active radiation. This is the section, or the portion rather, of the electromagnetic spectrum that contains the wavelengths of light that are responsible for running photosynthesis. All right. So PAR declines exponentially in aquatic and marine systems with water depth because water is very good at absorbing certain wavelengths of light. Water absorbs light much more readily than the atmosphere does. So, the photosynthetic rate and therefore the gross primary productivity of phytoplankton are highest at intermediate levels of PAR, or photosynthetically active radiation. The reason for this is because, and it's kind of ironic when you think about it, but extreme high levels of sunlight can actually have a limiting effect on the rate of photosynthesis. Too much sunlight can actually slow the rate of photosynthesis. It's called photoinhibition, and this occurs in phytoplankton, for example, microscopic algae that float in the water column of freshwater and marine systems. So at the surface levels of the water where you have the most intense sunlight sometimes, that's where you can actually get lower levels of photosynthesis and therefore gross primary productivity. As you go deeper in the water and some of that light becomes attenuated and gets absorbed and it dims a little bit, then you have actually higher levels of gross primary productivity. Now, photosynthesis, therefore, does change with depth, but respiration typically doesn't. Okay, so respiration, which again is the breakdown of organic compounds, that's fairly constant as depth increases. Now, for phytoplankton deeper in the water column, light intensity and photosynthesis decrease, as we've said. And so whenever we have gross primary productivity equaling respiration, that means our net primary productivity equals zero. The depth at which that occurs is called the compensation depth. Okay, the compensation depth. All right, that's an important sort of threshold, I guess you could say, in the water column. And it's going to vary depending on light intensity, water clarity, which again would affect light intensity. All sorts of factors come into play there to determine at what depth compensation occurs. All right, now nutrients in deeper waters in the oceans have to be transported to surface waters where photosynthetically active radiation can actually then support photosynthesis. So, because of this, because of the fact that nutrients have to come out of the sediments and things in the deeper waters, because of this, nutrients, especially, for example, iron, nitrogen, and phosphorus, can actually be a major limiting factor in terms of the rate of net primary production. Okay, so with regard to aquatic and marine systems, typically it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron that are the limiting nutrients. Okay, if everything else is in abundance, but these three things are limiting, you'll get limiting effects on primary productivity or net primary productivity. So there have been a lot of experiments done over the past several decades, what are called nutrient enrichment experiments, where they add various nutrients to freshwater and marine systems to look and see what the effect might be on phytoplankton growth, net and primary productivity, and so on. And in particular, in these experiments where they've done this in the oceans, what they found is that nitrogen addition stimulated phytoplankton growth the most. Iron followed relatively closely in stimulating growth in most cases, but most of these studies found that phosphorus addition, or the addition of phosphorus, didn't really stimulate phytoplankton growth. So it seems to not, phosphorus in oceans anyway, seems to not be a limiting nutrient as far as primary productivity goes. We're going to see later on that's not true in freshwater systems. Freshwater systems are by and large thought to be phosphorus limited, whereas marine systems are by and large nitrogen limited, okay, and iron limited as well. So these results then of all these different studies are typically viewed as average responses and may not account for really specific habitat differences. So if we look at a figure here, we can see some of this. And again, this is in the oceans. These are sort of a summary of results from a number of different studies, nutrient enrichment studies. And what you can see is that nitrogen and iron resulted in the greatest positive change in growth rate. So the most increase in growth rate, I guess you should say. This orange line is the no change line or no effect line, and you see that the phosphorus average is right there on it. So for this reason, again, marine systems are not viewed as being phosphorus limited. It's nitrogen primarily and then iron secondarily that are limiting in these systems. If you have everything else, but you don't have nitrogen or iron, then you won't get a lot of phytoplankton growth in marine systems. That's what nitrogen/iron limiting means. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is the what parts of the ocean tend to have the highest primary production versus what parts don't. The next figure is going to show the role of environmental constraints on primary production in the oceans. And so when we look at this, an important question to ask is, why are the shallow waters and coastal environments of the oceans the most productive? Sorry, that's the one I'm looking at. That figure I just ran past. We're going to skip that one. Okay, so this is the figure that shows the average net primary productivity of the oceans on a global scale, so planet-wide. And what you see then is that the areas in red have the highest productivity. Again, this is going to be grams of carbon assimilated per square meter per year. So this is how much inorganic carbon as CO2 is being converted to carbon per square meter per year, okay, of ocean surface. And you see that in the red areas, that's where you have upwards of 800 grams of carbon per square meter per year. The dark blue areas, which are in some of the open ocean areas and some of the southern ocean areas, for example, very, very little, if any. Now, around the coastal regions, that's where you tend to get, the most red, orange, green, and light blue coloration, indicating that you get the highest production in the coastal areas, all right? And in some cases, you have large swaths, like in the North Atlantic, extending from Newfoundland all the way across to Ireland and England or Great Britain, for example. You do get some of that because of the prevailing ocean currents that drag that productivity out across the oceans. But the productivity is basically being or originating in the coastal regions, as you can see from this figure. Okay, so why are the shallow waters then in coastal environments of the oceans the most productive? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, shallow waters allow for a greater transport of nutrients from the bottom sediments to the surface waters, because here you have, in relatively shallow waters, the wave action and tides can be more effective in bringing those nutrients out of the sediments into the surface waters. In really, really deep parts of the ocean, the wave action and tides have almost no effect on that because there's so much distance between the surface of the ocean and the bottom. Now, also, coastal waters receive nutrients from terrestrial ecosystems. So you have streams and rivers, for example, that are transporting nutrients from terrestrial systems, grasslands, forests and areas, that kind of thing, marshes and swamps, and all that nutrient load that's being coming from those terrestrial systems washes into the oceans at estuaries where rivers dump into the ocean, and that's one of the reasons why you get so much productivity in these coastal areas as well. In addition to that, shallow water, the nutrients being more available from the sediments in shallow waters, like we said. All right, so an important question to ask then is, what are the constraints on net primary productivity in freshwater ecosystems? Well, solar radiation limits net primary productivity in lake ecosystems, okay? Light intensity and temperature are very closely linked in these cases, and nutrient availability on net primary productivity in lake ecosystems has been very well studied, and there's also a clear pattern here of increasing net primary productivity with increasing phosphorus concentration, like I said a few minutes ago. So the freshwater systems then, lakes, rivers, streams, wetlands, that sort of thing, are known for being phosphorus limited. This is the one thing that if it's added to a system, if everything else is present in the amounts needed, you add phosphorus and it will cause net primary productivity to go up. This is one of the reasons why back in the 80s, late 1980s, early 1990s, I believe it was, there were a lot of restrictions put on the addition of phosphate chemicals in detergents and soaps and that sort of thing, because those phosphates were getting into freshwater systems and causing algal blooms, what's called eutrophication, where you add all these nutrients, mostly in the form of phosphorus from pollution from human activity, and it causes algal blooms, degradation of water quality, and that sort of thing. And that's why you very often see phosphate-free being advertised with regard to detergents. Okay, so phytoplankton net primary productivity, which can be estimated by chlorophyll concentration, is strongly correlated with total phosphorus concentration. We know that. That's a well-documented pattern. Here you see an example of it. So here we have total phosphorus in milligrams per cubic meter of water, all right? And here you can see going 0 up to 1,000. And here we have summer chlorophyll concentration, milligrams per cubic meter. Distinct correlation there, very, very tight correlation, one-to-one correlation. So that's a clear pattern, and this is generally seen in nearly every freshwater system where this has been looked at. But again, you don't see this in the oceans because phosphorus is not limiting in the oceans. There, it's primarily nitrogen and iron, as we saw earlier. Okay, now let's talk about some bigger picture issues with regard to net primary productivity in stream ecosystems. Well, we know that net primary productivity is limited by both light and nutrient availability in stream ecosystems. Okay, so there have been lots of studies done on the effect of both light availability and nutrient availability on primary production in streams. And in some cases, they do these in situ, which means they do them in the actual stream systems. In a lot of cases, they actually do these in artificial stream type setups, experimental setups at research stations. And so a number of these studies where they've looked at it in terms or using these artificial stream setups have found some very important relationships. What they can do with these artificial stream systems setups or experiments is they can actually alter light availability and nutrient availability independently or sometimes both together, okay, as we'll see. So light availability, they found limited production during the summer the most, okay? And so the greatest leaf canopy cover reduced light levels to the lowest values during the summer. And so there, light availability seemed to be the most critical factor. You can think about it, if you've got a relatively small stream with forest on either side of it, the stream isn't that wide. The canopy of the trees growing on either side of the banks, or the two banks, can actually sort of arch over and cover much of that stream and shade it from incoming sunlight. So you tend to get these light limiting effects being more dramatic in these small streams, small woodland streams, as compared to, say, large streams, large rivers, which are so wide that any canopy effects are essentially non-existent because the river is so wide. As far as nutrient availability, what these studies generally find is that nutrients are more limiting during the fall and the spring. And during the fall and the spring, the canopy is more open, so light levels increase. So light during the fall and spring tends not to be a limiting factor, but nutrients then are more of a limiting factor, okay? The greatest increases in net primary productivity were found in these types of studies when both light and nutrients were enhanced. So there's a figure here that kind of shows this. The figure on the top is, let's see, that is a spring experiment. I'm sorry, that's a fall experiment. This is a fall experiment, and this is a spring experiment. And so what you see here is standing biomass, what's called ash-free dry mass. Basically, you take a sample of algae or plant material, whatever, and you combust it at a high temperature, about 500 degrees C in a muffle furnace, and you measure the weight of it beforehand and the weight coming out, and by difference in weight, you can estimate how much organic carbon was driven off as it was burned. That's what ash-free dry mass is. It's basically a measure of productivity. Okay, so same thing here on this y-axis, standing biomass. And here we have a situation where we have ambient light and nutrient conditions. Okay, ambient. So this would be shaded stream with, for example, low nutrient treatment. Here we have a highlight treatment. Again, low nutrients though, so they just affected or just altered light here. Here we have a high nutrient treatment with low light levels. So here they just amended nutrients or added nutrients. And here they increased both light and nutrients. And so for in both cases, you see that it was the nutrient plus light enhancement treatment that resulted in the greatest standing biomass or the greatest effect or increase in net primary production. Okay. All right, and that's true in fall and summer. I'm sorry, fall and spring. Okay. All right. So it does vary on a seasonal basis, obviously, and what turns out to be a limiting factor during one part of the year, say light, for example, might not be a limiting factor later in the year. Something else like nutrients might be later on in the year. It just depends. Okay. So now we're going to start talking about the sources of nutrients or organic carbon, let's say, to these terrestrial freshwater systems like rivers, lakes, and streams. Well, we have two categories of sources of organic carbon. The organic carbon can be produced within the system itself, say within a stream, for example, or a river by the phytoplankton that are living in that, or it can run into the stream from the land surface or from some other source. If we're talking about organic carbon that's being produced in the system itself, the term for that is autochthonous. Okay, that's a U. Autochthonous. So think auto, self, right? Autochthonous. This is organic carbon produced within a particular ecosystem. All right. So you have a river or a lake. The phytoplankton in that river or lake are running photosynthesis. They're converting inorganic carbon as CO2 to organic. And because they did it within that system, that's autochthonous organic carbon. All right. It comes from photosynthesis by aquatic photoautotrophs, plants, phytoplankton, algae, that sort of thing. But if we're talking about carbon that is produced outside of an ecosystem but then moves into the ecosystem in question, then that's referred to as allochthonous. Okay, allochthonous. This is carbon produced outside the system. It generally comes from dead organic matter input from adjacent terrestrial ecosystems. So you have organic matter in the soils and the leaf litter, for example, in a forest adjacent on either side of a stream. And when it rains, the surface runoff carries that organic material from those detrital or those decomposer processes into that stream. That's allochthonous carbon input. Okay. It can be either what's called DOM, dissolved organic matter, or POM, particulate organic matter, sediment and that sort of thing. All right, or even leaves, whole leaves, for example, are a good example of allochthonous organic carbon inputs to a stream, river, or lake. Now, the importance of allochthonous sources of carbon varies among different aquatic ecosystems. In marine ecosystems, it's primarily autochthonous inputs, right? I mean, the oceans are so vast, so huge, with so much water in them. The vast majority of the organic carbon that you find at any given moment in the oceans is produced by the phytoplankton in the ocean. So it's autochthonous, all right? Now, smaller freshwater systems, small stream ecosystems, for example, allochthonous carbon from surrounding forests is the predominant source of organic carbon. And primarily there it's dead plant material which is providing that for the most part, okay? And this is important because shading by trees limits photoautotrophs in a small stream system, like we said. And think about you've been hiking up in the Smoky Mountains, for example. You go up to a mountain on the trail and a stream is running adjacent to the trail. It's a very small stream and you're in the middle of very dense forest. There's not a lot of sunlight, so there's not a lot of phytoplankton in that stream that's using photosynthesis to fix carbon, to convert it from inorganic to organic form. Most of the organic carbon in that stream is coming from the leaf litter, the vegetation, the decomposition processes in the soil adjacent to that stream, and it's running into that stream. All right. Now, what happens as that stream then, as it moves down the mountain, let's say, in the Smokies, what happens as it widens farther downstream and eventually transitions to a river that then runs to the coast somewhere and dumps into the ocean? Well, we know that trees live along the banks, okay, and so shading becomes limited to the margins of the stream as that stream gets larger because the canopy is no longer large enough to be able to cover or envelop the entire surface of that stream as that stream gets bigger. So as a result, as you go further downstream, more light is available. At that point, then, net primary productivity by plants, algae, and phytoplankton begins to increase, and autochthonous carbon then becomes more important than allochthonous, okay? All right, so the character of the river in terms of sources of organic carbon subtly changes from headwater streams down to where the river dumps into the ocean, for example. This has resulted in what's called, or I'm sorry, the way we describe this is as the river continuum concept. Okay, the river continuum concept. Basically, it describes this continuum of the relative importance of allochthonous and autochthonous sources of carbon in flowing water ecosystems. So let's take a look. All right. So here you can see a small mountain stream, very much like what you might see up in the Smoky Mountains, for example. As I said, the stream's not very wide. You have a lot of canopy over top of that, and that's providing a lot of shade. There's not a lot of light probably getting through into that stream. And so the vast majority of the organic carbon in that stream is probably running in or washing in through runoff into that stream. Now, compare that with a large lake or river, for example, where, on a sunny day, the whole thing is exposed to sunlight for as long as the sun's out. You have very little canopy shading effects. I mean, along the margins you have some, but it's a very small amount. So you're going to have a lot more autochthonous carbon being produced here, or I should say a higher proportion of the organic carbon in that system is going to be autochthonously produced by the phytoplankton in that system. And so this is showing you the relative contribution to total organic carbon in a water sample from various parts of streams and rivers as we go from smaller streams downstream to larger rivers, okay? So if we look at phytoplankton, first of all, we see that phytoplankton are not contributing very much at all in these small streams, again, because of those shading effects. But as the stream gets bigger and the canopy opens up and it gets more sunlight, the phytoplankton start to come into their own and have a much larger, or begin to have a much larger impact on or contribution to organic carbon. Let's look at attached algae. So here we're talking about, the films of attached algae on rocks and other kind of surfaces, for example. Even in the very headwater streams, there's not going to be enough light for those guys. They don't do very well. But as that stream begins to open up a little bit, probably about like what you see right here, then you can start to see quite a bit of algae and that sort of thing. But then they become limited as the sunlight becomes too intense for them, as the stream gets larger and the canopy sort of falls away, and then they just don't do well. Now, macrophytes. So these are fairly large aquatic plants that are embedded in the sediments, in the stream bed, let's say. They, again, don't do well in these rocky streams, in headwater streams. There's not a lot of sediment in those streams, but also for soil, but there's also that canopy shading effect. But as you move downstream and the stream slows down, you get more sedimentation, you get more soil building up, more sediment, and the light intensity goes up, and they start to do well a little bit further downstream from where attached algae do. But then eventually what happens here is that usually the water becomes more turbid. So as you transition from a small mountain stream to more of a lowland stream, the water becomes murkier, more sediment load coming in, and it becomes deeper as well. The rivers do. And so at the bottom, there's just not enough light left for these macrophytes, and they kind of peter out. I mean, they don't go out, out entirely, but their contribution to organic carbon certainly drops. But it's the phytoplankton that really then take off. And so in large lakes and large streams, they're the ones contributing the vast majority of organic carbon to that system. Okay. And you can see what happens to the allochthonous matter. It's very important, obviously, in the small streams, like we said, but its importance diminishes as you get down to larger rivers and then kind of flattens out. Again, this is the river continuum concept. Okay, what about lake ecosystems? So the relative importance of internal and external carbon sources here depends on a couple of things. The size of the lake, first of all. The shape of the lake can have a dramatic impact on this. And what kind of surrounding terrestrial environment you have. What is the watershed, or the catchment, as it's called, composed of? Is it more grassland? Is it tropical forest? Is it temperate deciduous forest? What is it? Is it marsh or something like that, or wetland? That can have a very dramatic effect, or important effect on internal and external carbon sources in a lake. All right. With larger lakes, generally, again, it's going to be autochthonous sources of carbon that predominate, just like we see in larger rivers. Allochthonous inputs, either as dissolved organic matter or particulate organic matter, tend to vary seasonally with the volume of water flowing into the lake. So in the rainy season, in spring, for example, you get a lot of runoff from the surface or the surrounding area into that lake, and so their DOM and POM can be very important. But in the height of the summer, when things are kind of stagnating and you're in a dry period, it's mostly going to be autochthonous sources of carbon that predominate. Now, in smaller lakes, allochthonous inputs can be significant, and they can be significant year-round because just because the lake is so small, and relatively speaking, there's such a large input of water from the surrounding catchment or watershed. In small lakes in a forested area, for example, maybe more than 50% of organic carbon in the food web can actually be allochthonous, okay, in these very small lakes. That's not going to be true in a large lake for most of the year anyway. All right. So primary production then varies within an ecosystem with time and age, okay? We're kind of getting away from the aquatic and marine systems now. We do have, and talking about broader ideas here, we do have seasonal variation, okay, in primary production. Some regions will have cold winters and hot summers, and that can have dramatic effects on primary production. Some regions have distinct wet and dry seasons, and so you'll see predictable patterns there in terms of primary production. Plants are often dormant with little or no net primary productivity in cold or dry conditions, and that's really a key point here. This is all, for the most part, plant-driven, right? We're talking about primary production, which is photosynthesis, okay? So climatic effects on plants, therefore, drive these climatic effects or resulting effects on primary production. So I'm going to take an example here. Here we can see just a figure showing you the sort of cyclical nature of net primary productivity in kilograms of carbon per hectare per day, right? So here we have 2 years, so January to December and then January to December, and you can see that in March, leaf out, okay? That's when we start to get dramatic increases in net primary productivity. Goes pretty much all summer. Now, notice that in July and August, September, you start to get drier conditions. That's why this tends to drop, usually a little wetter in the spring. And then we get fall leaf drop, usually around October or by the end of October, and everything stops, all right? Nothing over the winter, same pattern again for the following year, okay? So this is what I mean by seasonal variation. All right, now you don't get that kind of variation, obviously, in the tropics, where you have very, stable or constant climatic conditions year-round, especially right on the equator. This is more what you would see in a temperate zone, okay? Now, annual variation can also occur if there is climatic variation. So wet years, dry years, extremely warm years, extremely cool years, that sort of thing. And that's what you're seeing here. So I don't remember exactly where this data was taken from, but it does show that annual net primary productivity can fluctuate quite considerably from one year to the next. This is tons of carbon per hectare per year in this case, but this is due to more annual climatic variation rather than shorter term, smaller scale seasonal variation. All right. primary production certainly then varies with time. That's what we've been talking about here these past few slides. There have been a number of long-term ecological research studies that have looked at this sort of thing. There are a number of, in the United States, there are a number of long-term ecological research stations sort of scattered throughout the country. One of the best known ones is the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, I believe up in New Hampshire. But other countries have these as well, and there's a famous one, a long-term park grass experiment at Rothamsted Experimental Station in England. They've been looking at grass productivity since 1856. They've actually had experiments going on there since 1856. Now, the standardized data they have collected has been going on since about 1965. So they have, over 50 years now of data from this one place. So because they have so much data over such a long time frame, they can see examples of not only seasonal, but also annual climatic variation and its effect on primary production. What they found is that grass yields are generally depressed in hot, dry summers. And so here's some of that data. So here you can see 1964 up to 2004. So here we have late summer hay. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Here we have the yield in tons per hectare. So you can see it does vary quite a bit, talking anywhere from a little less than 1 ton up to 3 tons per hectare. That's a dramatic change. But here we have, for example, periods of very hot, dry weather, which give rise to low primary productivity of grasses. So this is our productivity. Here we have temperature. So you can see that low productivity, that sort of dip right there, corresponds to a sort of bump in temperature, and a temperature extreme at that same time, 1975, 76 maybe. Here we have an increase or a peak in primary production, and this corresponds to a period of sort of cool, wet weather, okay? And that resulted again in high primary productivity. So this is what these sort of long-term ecological research stations are known for, is showing these sort of long-term patterns that really relate to climatic fluctuations, longer-term, larger-scale climatic fluctuations, and how they affect primary production and various other things. Okay, so disturbances, in addition to climatic changes and that sort of thing, disturbances can cause year-to-year variation in net primary productivity at a site. Herbivory, right? Overgrazing of grasslands by cattle and sheep, for example, can certainly affect net primary productivity. Defoliation of forests by gypsy moths. We talked about gypsy moths in an earlier chapter, an invasive exotic species. Fire certainly can increase productivity in wet years and reduce it in dry years. So there's all sorts of other things in addition to seasonal variation, annual climatic variation, that can cause changes in net primary productivity, and in many cases sort of in unpredictable ways, and at least in terms of fire and exotic species invasions and that kind of thing. Now, net primary production varies with stand age as well. So here, think about trees, right? Especially in ecosystems dominated by woody vegetation. Trees and woody shrubs, for example, can have very long lifespans, talking decades in many cases, and this can influence how energy is sort of used or allocated, and how net primary production can change over periods of decades. So we look at an example of this. Here you see, I think this is for a temperate forest ecosystem. Here you have ecosystem age in years, right? So let's say it's cut and then allowed to grow back, right? So going up to about 70 years. Here we have decadal net primary productivity, so measured every 10 years, all right? So again, tons of carbon per hectare per year. You see that it generally starts off kind of flat for the first decade or so, maybe 15 years of the forest growing back, and then begins to peak upward, and peaks maybe around 50 years and then begins to drop off again. Well, so an important question is, why does it drop off like that? Well, it has to do with a number of things. One of them is the succession of the forest and the species that are dominant at one time versus another. but it also has to do with the ratio of woody tissue biomass to leaf biomass. So early in life, leaves are more than one half of the biomass of a tree. Think about a sapling, for example. The leaves can be more than a half of the overall biomass of that tree, whereas the woody tissue can be much less. Later in life, as that tree gets bigger, the woody growth makes up an ever larger proportion of the overall biomass, and the leaf proportion goes down in a comparative sense. All right, and that's what this figure here is showing you. So here we have diameter at breast height. Remember, we measured that for our trees out at the Pauline Longus Nature Trails earlier in the semester. And so obviously as tree age goes up, DBH goes up, all right? Here we have the proportion of total biomass. So we see that early on, most of the biomass, or at least half of it, is in foliage, right? That's the red line. But then as the trees begin to grow, that proportion allocated to foliage drops off and sort of plateaus around maybe 15 or 20 years and then really doesn't change much at all. Branches, how much biomass is allocated into branches, that generally doesn't change a whole lot relative to what's in foliage, what's in the stem wood, the trunk of the tree. And you can see the stem wood takes off very early on and eventually, or very quickly, dominates in terms of what proportion of biomass it accounts for in that tree. All right. So as the stand ages, the rates of both photosynthesis and respiration decline. More gross primary production, which is, again, photosynthesis, is going to be used for maintenance, respiration in woody tissues, so less is available for growth. So the woody tissues, right, those that are living anyway, as that tree gets bigger, they account for an ever larger proportion of the total tree's biomass, right? So a larger proportion of the photosynthetic output in terms of sugars has to be allocated towards keeping those cells alive and maintaining those cells through respiration. That means less of that organic carbon output from photosynthesis can then be put toward growth. All right, so that means that less net primary productivity is available as the forest ages to contribute to growth. And this is why we tend to see net primary production dropping off, or slowing down at least, or declining, I guess is a better way to put it, as that forest stand ages. All right, and this is another way to sort of look at that. So here what you're seeing is the age in years, and here we have the annual net primary productivity. This is tons per hectare per year. So this is the stand age in years, and you can see again we have sort of an upward arching line, which peaks out around maybe 55, 65, or 70 years, then begins to drop away again. And so again, that's a result of so much of these trees, these older trees, their biomass being composed of woody tissue, which can't photosynthesize. That means that because those cells have to be maintained, they take up an ever larger proportion of the photosynthetic output, the gross primary productivity, which means there's less of that productivity, the net, right? That's what's left after respiration. There's less of that left available for growth. Okay, and this is a pattern that we tend to see in forested ecosystems. All right, that's the end then of the second video lecture for chapter 20. We should be able to get everything else finished in the third video lecture, so look for that soon.